An Introduction to Constitutional Law, 100 plus Supreme Court cases everyone should know, by Randy Barnett and Josh Blackman. Enumerated Powers on the Chase Court, United States v. Dewitt, 1869, Hepburn v. Griswold, 1870, and Knox v. Lee, 1871. In different eras, the Supreme Court has interpreted the scope of Congress's enumerated powers in different ways. The Marshall Court, in McCulloch v. Maryland, interpreted the Necessary and Proper Clause to give Congress a lot of discretion to implement its other enumerated powers. And in Gibbons v. Ogden, the Marshall Court defined commerce as intercourse and interpreted among the several states as concerning more states than one. The Taney Court continued the trend set by the Marshall Court. Prigg v. Pennsylvania read Congress's implied powers under the Necessary and Proper Clause even more broadly than had McCulloch to uphold the constitutionality of the Fugitive Slave Act. After Roger Taney died in October 1864, President Lincoln fittingly appointed his Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, as the Chief Justice. As an anti-slavery lawyer, Chase had argued that the Fugitive Slave Act was unconstitutional based on a narrower reading of congressional power. In the span of 3 years, the Chase Court would hear 3 important cases about the scope of Congress's enumerated powers: U.S. v. Dewitt in 1869, Hepburn v. Griswold in 1870, and Knox v. Lee in 1871. In 1867, Congress criminalized the sale of oil that was made from petroleum. Mr. Dewitt was indicted for selling oil in Detroit, Michigan. Study guide: what enumerated power gives Congress the power to criminalize the sale of oil? Chief Justice Chase held that the Commerce Clause by itself was not enough to uphold the statute. In a passage that echoed Chief Justice Marshall's opinion in Gibbons, Chase wrote that the Commerce Clause is a, quote, virtual denial to Congress of any power to interfere with the internal trade and business of the separate states. Congress can interfere with internal trade when it is a necessary and proper means of carrying into execution some other power expressly granted or vested. Chief Justice Chase's opinion teaches the vital lesson that when considering the scope of Congress's enumerated powers, we can never stop with the Commerce Clause. We must also always consider the Necessary and Proper Clause. Chase also rejected the claim that it was necessary and proper to criminalize the sale of petroleum-based oils to more effectively enforce its power to lay and collect taxes on the local sale of oil. Employing Marshall's construction from McCulloch, Chase concluded that this consequence is too remote and too uncertain to warrant us in saying that the prohibition is an appropriate and plainly adapted means for carrying into execution the power of laying and collecting taxes. To appreciate the next 2 cases, it is important to distinguish between the power to issue paper notes or currency and the power to make that currency a legal tender. That is, by requiring everyone, by law, to accept the government's paper currency as payment for a debt regardless of what their contracts may say. Does the Constitution give Congress this power? The next 2 cases resolved this question. During the Civil War, as Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase had supported the passage of the Legal Tender Act. The federal government even put his face on the $1 bill known as a greenback. However, 8 years later in Hepburn v. Griswold, as Chief Justice, Chase found that Congress lacked the power to require people to accept paper currency as legal tender. The court observed that there is, quote, no express grant of legislative power to create paper legal tender. Though the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce, coin money, and borrow money, it does not give Congress the power to make people accept paper currency. Neither, Chase held, does the Constitution give Congress any implied powers under the Necessary and Proper Clause to make paper currency a legal tender. Chief Justice Chase reasoned that the power to require people to accept paper money is not incidental to the power to regulate commerce or to coin money or to borrow money. He concluded that, quote, an act making mere promises to pay dollars a legal tender in payment of debts previously contracted is not a means appropriate, plainly adapted, really calculated to carry into effect any express power vested in Congress. To appreciate this, you need to know that while we today think of dollar bills, the term dollar in the Constitution originally referred to a unit of silver, in particular to the Spanish dollar coin, which was in wide circulation at the founding. Making people accept dollar bills in place of silver or gold dollars was a big deal. Now comes the fun part. When Hepburn was argued in November 1869, there were only 8 justices on the bench. After arguments, there were 5 votes against the Legal Tender Act and 3 votes in favor of it. However, in January 1870, Justice Grier resigned before the decision was formally announced, making the final vote 4-3. After Hepburn was decided, President Grant appointed Justices Strong and Bradley, both of whom were on record in favor of paper money as legal tender. So now, there were 5 justices who thought that the Legal Tender Act was constitutional. Sure enough, when the court heard another challenge to the Legal Tender Act just a year later, it reversed itself to rule that the Legal Tender Act was constitutional after all. In Knox v. Lee, Hepburn was now overturned by a vote of 5-4. The Knox court cited the need of the Legal Tender Act during the emergencies of the Civil War. Study guide. Does the end of the emergency caused by the Civil War entail the end of the power to enact legal tender laws? But Knox did far more than this. The decision also adopted a much broader construction of the Necessary and Proper Clause, one that went beyond even Justice Story's construction in Prigg v. Pennsylvania. Indeed, the majority's construction in Knox may be the most capacious reading of the Necessary and Proper Clause ever articulated by the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Chase, who was now in dissent, lamented that under the majority's approach, the, quote, powers of government become practically absolute and unlimited. Salmon Chase died 2 years later, in 1873. While the narrower construction of the enumerated powers articulated in the Dewitt case would be echoed during the Progressive era at the end of the 19th and start of the 20th century, the Prigg and Knox decisions were the harbingers of how the Supreme Court would eventually treat the scope of Congress's enumerated powers in the wake of the New Deal.